Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Heretic Hammer podcast. I'm your host, Marshall, and this is my co-host, Dylan.
Hello, hello.
And today we are talking about the priesthood of Mars, otherwise known as the Adeptus Mechanicus, as it is today. They're not without their fair share of controversy in Imperial history, and we will go over that and their wacky ways all in this episode today.
Like Looney Tunes wacky? Like, what scale are we working with
it
here?
feels like that sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I was saying this before we started recording, but just because I want to instill a little bit of relevancy. I was really tempted to make this an episode about to pivot us to the Adeptus Custodes because of some recent controversies and how I think they're stupid. But nevertheless, we're not doing that today, as much as I will say that inevitably when we do the AdMech episode, you will not find the words woke in the title. Sorry if this disappoints you.
What? Sorry, no giant red arrows in the thumbnail? No circles?
No.
I gotta find me a new podcast.
No saying now begins the 40K boycott. In fact, I'm doing the opposite. I'm bringing people to this game. But today, instead, we're going to be talking about a slightly less controversial and a group that nobody who plays them is angry about. Oh, no, wait, that's not true either. They're for a different reason. We'll get to that when we get to the game portion. Let's start with the lore. That's always a great place to start with any of these factions, though.
All right, what do you got?
All right, so the tech priests of Mars, they are a strange bunch, as I've kind of already alluded to. I mean, you can kind of just look at them and kind of be like, your first thought might be obviously that they look pretty cool. But then you may look a little closer and be like, that's a little weird. Looking at the Codex cover, for example, you'll see a large, mostly machine man who is holding a staff with two of his robotic arms. He has two other robotic arms in a prayer symbol, and then his decrepit, decaying human arms also up in prayer. Mm-hmm.
There's just so many arms where there doesn't need to be arms in our world, at least. It's just a lot of arms going on.
You know, not in our world. Maybe some would view not in the 40K world either. But to the Adeptus Mechanicus, that is the way that is pleasing to the Omnissiah.
The Omnissiah.
Yes. So the AdMech, as they are shortened as, and I'll mostly call them going through this episode, are collectors. Some think them insane, but what they are those who thirst for knowledge. That is their big thing, is they want to go out into the universe and discover technology. They want to embrace machinery. Okay. An important note that we'll get into later is the AdMech do, though, believe that nothing can surpass what was created during the dark age of technology. So while they embrace in machinery, they do not seek to advance it, only to rediscover what was once created. And to their fairness in that regard, they have a distinct point in that there was so much technology that was lost from the fall of that first, human empire that colonized much of the stars in the Milky Way, that or the planets technically, that they that there is so much to rediscover that they just don't see the need to do so. But they are followers of the Omnissiah. They are the believers that the machine spirit will guide their way. So in order to understand the Mechanicus, we should first understand the Omnissiah and the machine spirit. So the Omnissiah is a little tricky to kind of nail correctly. For the longest time, the Omnissiah was just kind of used as the name of the machine god that the Admech worship. But in a more general kind of tactical sense, it is the understanding that the Admech believe the Omnissiah to be kind of like a mix of the Emperor and the machine spirit. So the Admech believe that in all machines are spirits, much like ours, kind of like, their own souls, and that we must respect them in order to work with them, right? They've essentially, like, if you think about it around your surroundings, your phone to them has a machine spirit in it. Your computer, your TV, your Honda Civic, anything that you have has a machine spirit in it.
I don't know about that one.
Well, it may have a machine spirit, but it's a wild machine spirit.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a wily one. Also, it may, depending on what you do to it, will refuse to die. They've always believed, since their inception as a cult, in the greater machine god, right? They think there is inherently while the machine spirit exists in all not creatures, but mostly like all technology and all machines, there is obviously the concept though that they are all linked to a main machine god. Mm. And then they believe the Emperor, especially the current Adeptus Mechanicus, and I'll explain that in a moment, is the avatar of the machine god. Hence why he is kind of labeled when they say the Omnissiah, it is kind of that mix between the two, because inevitably there's the belief in the Admech that he is kind of the avatar of the machine spirit. This, however, wasn't always the belief of all the tech priests, because before the Adeptus Mechanicus existed, there was just the Mechanicum. And this goes back all the way to Mars during Old Night, or kind of after the fall of the Dark Age of technology, human civilization. In that time, Mars reverted from being this kind of Earth-like world, essentially almost a twin of Earth, to the desert waste that it once was and is in our current day. But there were still people on that. And in that, during that time, those who survived did because of the machines that protected them and then that gave them their life support systems and oxygen and all that. And so quickly gaining power amongst the Martians was a cult that worshipped those machines that kept them alive. They inevitably believed that, despite that there was so much reason for them to have completely shut down. I mean, there is effectively like part of what happened with Mars was effectively like a nuclear holocaust on the surface due to a bunch of stuff shutting down that and breaking and then thus exploding, that they feel that their survival is given to the machines, or is from the machines, and therefore they feel a spiritual connection because of that.
And these machines aren't
of being spared.
These machines aren't like sentient or anything, right? Like it's just the tools.
So they believe inherently the machine spirit within it is, but not the machine itself. And that obviously comes from the kind of especially inevitable distrust and due to obviously all the AI systems that humanity was dealing with from the Men of Iron kind of turning against them, right? So that obviously comes into that. So no, none of the ones that they specifically worship have any direct sentience, right? And because again, they believe it's in all of their machines, whether it's just a gun that literally to us just is, a simple mechanism of springs and gunpowder, to the generators that keep power and oxygen flowing. As they inevitably gained pretty much power over the whole planet, they inevitably also were able to then have a just a significant growth of technology and inevitably formed what was kind of the first forge world in Mars. Effectively just an entire planet filled of industry and machinery and, creation of, weaponry, walkers, tanks, flyers, all this stuff. And obviously the Emperor, when all the warp storms faded and he could start kind of branching out to try to, bring humanity back together, he understood that they made a lot of the machines and weapons that he was going to desperately need in order to traverse through space, especially the ships that could go through the warp and go to planets and go through all of that. And while he could have attempted to force compliance with them, as he inevitably would with every other world, he instead opted for a treaty, the Treaty of Mars, which would see them operate a lot more freely, which is why it's important to kind of remember that a lot of the tech priests and the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Mechanicum at this point, they are technically not part of the Imperium, but they are allies to the Imperium. It's actually why if you look at the Imperial logo, like the Aquila as it's called, it has two heads on it. And they're supposedly supposed to represent Terra and Mars. So the eagle with the eye on it is supposed to be Terra, and the one without the eye is supposed to be Mars.
Birds of a feather. Okay.
So, but that's kind of also why they're able to believe in the religion that they do. Because if you kind of remember, when the Emperor was around, he had banned all religion in the Imperium because inevitably he had known of the dangers of chaos and what that meant, and also had just obviously seen wars of mankind throughout, all of its history between, negative 3000 BC and up to 30,000, right? So, or I think it was like 25,000. So yeah, he saw a lot. And realized that could be a problem. But again, it was really hard to it was going to be hard to bring the AdMech in without letting them kind of do their thing. So it's kind of one of those things where he signed the treaty and then probably internally was like, I'll deal with it when I need to deal with it kind of thing. But I need to get the rest of the Imperium together.
Yeah.
Then the Horus Heresy happens and all that. So, and that's actually a good segue because during the Horus Heresy then, the AdMech themselves, much like humanity and the Space Marines, are also split. There were many in the Mechanicum, and again, the Mechanicum is specifically pre-Horus Heresy Mars tech priests, right? The Adeptus Mechanicus and the Mechanicum are not the same. And and the reason why is this. There were many of those on Mars, who did not believe the Emperor to be the Omnissiah that they were kind of labeling him as. They just kind of thought he was a tyrant. And they also didn't necessarily maybe agree as much on his stance about AI. And, because while most of AdMech also inevitably, most of the tech priests also didn't trust it, there were some who were wanting maybe to do things like advanced technology and maybe use some of these things to help a little bit, maybe, kind of learn new forms of technology, like maybe including a little bit of chaos power into machines. So thus this led into what was known as the Schism of Mars and the rise of the Dark Mechanicum, who allied with Horus.
Because new technology is kind of a no-go.
Correct. But they also were kind of leading into new technology that included putting demons in them. So
yeah, that's not going to fly.
And Horus gave them an out. They were like, I will let you be totally independent. You will not be subject to me. I will let you go. And you'll be doing your own thing. You can do what you want. And, that's when they decided, okay, we'll work with him. And so, unfortunately, they do, in fact, take over Mars, because Terra doesn't act on this until much later, as inevitably they are prepping and squabbling to decide how they'll defend against Horus and now Mars as he approaches, along with other legions and most of the loyal legions still unreachable because they were unable to be contacted due to warp storms. While a lot of the loyal Mechanicum, tech priests went to Terra for refuge, they were not being kind of treated as loyal allies. They were kind of just being treated as outcasts who maybe fled a traitorous planet, but they themselves then are not worth trusting. So it was through then the loyal Mechanicum Archmagos, which is kind of the name of the leader, because then at that point there were technically two. There was a leader of the loyal tech priests and the leader of the dark tech priests. And because them being kind of robotic and machinery and them thinking and speaking in binary a lot of the time, the concept that there being two leaders, whether or not it mattered if they were on the Imperium side or not, because this wasn't their mindset, right? Their thought wasn't like the Imperium is the good guys and they're the bad guys. It was just kind of like, we believe in our original creed, but we can't have two leaders. We need to make one. Mm-hmm. And their way of figuring that out was they're like, well, what we'll do is the way that we can get the Imperium to work with us and we can force them to work with us and get Mars back is we technically join it, right? So they decided to essentially, through a long amount of convincing, charged political debate and a little bit of threatening from the houses that run the Titans, the gigantic skyscraper-sized war machines that exist and are helped maintained by the Mechanicum, to be let in. And they are then known from that point as the Adeptus Mechanicus.
Oh, okay.
So at that point now there is the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Dark Mechanicum. They then help the Loyalists on Terra win the heresy. They take back Mars. They obviously continue to help them forward. They develop other, in return, more Forge Worlds, but there are a number of Forge Worlds out there in the universe that still fell to the Dark Mechanicum and owned by them and operated by them, and who work with their Chaos Traders alike.
So where does that put them now?
So as the Mechanicus, they are still technically, they're like in a weird middle ground now, right? Where they are technically still independent because of the Treaty of Mars.
So that's still intact even after the heresy and everything.
Correct. But it's a little bit looser in comparison. Or, not looser. I can't think of the right word, but...
Murkier?
It's a little murkier now because they technically, as an Adeptus, are part of the Imperium. So they still have loyalties and answerings to the Imperium. But they, because of the Treaty of Mars, are still allowed their religious freedom. Because again, now, unlike in the Emperor where he had banned religion entirely, now obviously the religion is the cult of the Emperor, and the imperial religion being that of worshiping the Emperor. Mm-hmm. But like a good way then to understand, the Mechanicus is this quote, the Credo Omnissiah. There is no truth in flesh, only betrayal. There is no strength in flesh, only weakness. There is no constancy in flesh, only decay. There is no certainty in flesh, but death. This is like almost exactly where from the moment I saw the weakness of my flesh, it disgusted me.
From the moment I understood the weakness of my flesh, it disgusted me.
Because this is one of those things that I have heard, secondhand. One of those key catchphrases that gets passed around. But I've never had like the full context for it.
Yeah, I mean this fits right into that whole spiel. It is effectively just a different way of wording it almost, but like more personable.
Yeah.
So yeah, the Mechanicus ways, the Mechanicus, as I mentioned earlier, do not believe in advancement, but solely to rediscover the probably billions of STCs that were lost from the fall of the dark age of technology. And this might seem kind of backwards, but they just, again, like I said, they don't believe that they can come up with anything that wasn't already made back then. And why experiment, and get a bunch of things wrong, maybe blowing up a planet, trying to test things that even come close to legends of technology that you heard of previously, and lose a bunch of resources when they're so much more finite compared to when those STCs were made. Yeah. It's not like resources being finite is different in 40K than it is obviously today, right? Today we look at it finite as in being like, if we take too much from the earth will die, and there is no more. With 40K, it's more about like the availability of it to go around to everyone, because kind of like what we talked about in the last episode with the Tau, the Imperium is so large, to fling everything around in different directions takes so much time and, checking, and it can, there's so many planets that have to receive it, so everyone only receives such smaller bits at a time. So it's not that it's necessarily running low, but it's just that it takes more time, and the inefficiencies of such a large empire make it inefficient then to receive said materials.
Okay.
So again, why blow something up completely, ruin everything, and then lose said materials that already are stretched kind of thin. So that's kind of that would be like the main argument to why it's just better for them to go find an STC, which is called the Standard Template Construct, it's what's an acronym for. Okay. Why just go find those, because then we get exact blueprints of how to make this thing, what it will do, what it's made of, everything about it. And boom, we'll get it, and we'll pretty much know how it works. There is some things with this that create a little paranoia amongst the AdMech and may make them seem paranoid. But like I said, while there is some sense to their reasonings and their paranoia, a lot of that honestly can be kind of exemplified in a machine called the Iron Strider Ballistarius, or the Chicken Walker, as it's colloquially known as in the community.
Okay, those are two very different tones for names.
Yeah, well, I mean, look at the thing. Like,
yeah, I can see it for sure. Yeah.
It's like that's generally the 40K community, right?
She has the legs for it. I can see that. Yes.
And I mean, that's the thing about the 40K community, right? There will be a real name for something, the fluffy, Latin-esque 40K name, and then we, as a silly, doofy community, will give them a different dumb name.
It's what you do.
That's more easy to say, you know. But yeah, the funny, like, the thing about them is, so they never turn them off. They will essentially, like, wherever they have them stationed at, they will keep them running and effectively tie them to, like, a rock or whatever, or like a whatever post, and they will constantly be just like running in a circle tethered to this post, just constantly moving until they need to use them in battle, where they will corral them in, jump in, and then ride to battle, never stopping.
What are they running on? Do they use like a fuel or an energy source at all, or?
They are likely using, I mean, so what they are likely using, first of all, when they're posted, they are probably charging them and fueling them. But
yeah, they just got like a USB-C plugged in, sure.
A lot of these things, get power. A lot of these things, while they will have use of like, like petrol-based engines and stuff, they often will also run on batteries and things like that. So there's a lot of ways that machinery gets powered in 40K. But I think the Chicken Walkers also might be a really good example of Grimderp, where because the reason they do this is one guy figured out how these things worked from the STC and then died before he could share it.
Oh,
so he figured out how to turn them on. And so their paranoia is that if they turn them off, they'll never figure out how to turn them on again.
Oh no, it's your grandmother that refuses to close the internet browser because they're afraid if it updates it'll break the computer somehow.
Yep.
Oh,
exactly.
No.
So that's kind of a big thing, is like they kind of are paranoid, and obviously that the Chicken Walker story is kind of an example of Grimderp in that, like, obviously it's this thing to showcase how kind of not, despite being incredibly advanced and having these robotic walkers for war, they still inherently struggle to work and live, but it makes it kind of derpy because it doesn't have a great explanation. But again, it's a good example of like they seem paranoid, but there's kind of good reasons sometimes, right? Where it's like they do really need to use these because they're really good at being in battles, and they need to be in battles frequently. Mm-hmm. So why it's like we don't want to lose them, so let's just leave them on. They are so kind of and again, in a shift somewhat similar to the Emperor, because they kind of had agreements on this when they were making the Treaty of Mars, but again, it was more the Emperor kind of bringing this to the fold, where they believe AI to be abominable. They call it abominable intelligence rather than artificial. And so like the Imperium, they have deemed it totally illegal to use. The funny thing is STCs are in a way built and run, or like can survive because of essentially a tiny AI module that exists in it. But this is kind of one of those things where it's kind of just like they don't say that part out loud. Mm-hmm. They just kind of were like, yeah, we found this STC, we got it working, thanks, here's your thing, bye. Mm-hmm. But again, nobody questions them, because otherwise who's going to give them, if you piss off the people who make your guns, who's going to give you your guns?
Yeah.
So they got to do something really bad to get on the bad side of like Imperial Inquisitors and stuff like that. And then the other thing is they also then refuse on record to use alien technology. And I say it that way because there have been many times that they may or may not have borrowed, used, looked at, maybe gotten inspired by some, especially Necron technology that exists in the universe. They may or may not have woken up a lot of the Necrons by doing this. There's an entire video game about this concept, and it's actually very good, called Adeptus Mechanicus. You should play it. It's very good. But yeah, it's one of those things where like they're technically not supposed to use Xenos technology because they believe that the Omnissiah has given them the machines that they did because they were the correct machines, but they will use concepts from alien technology to tinker with, if you will. Mm-hmm. They sometimes, depending on the priest, because you can get in trouble, there are people who have taken this too far, right? Off the deep end. But there's the point, it's kind of the point a lot of the times with tech priests and Xenos technology, where it ends up kind of being a scenario where it's kind of just better to ask for forgiveness than permission.
Yeah, I feel like we've kind of, like, that's kind of been the modus operandi for like most of the things that we've talked about so far.
That's really a lot of how the Imperium works. Mm-hmm. All right, so next, one thing that's kind of important to understand, and it's inherently something that's involved in the Imperium of Man as a whole, pretty widely, but is kind of like it's relevant to bring up with the Adeptus Mechanicus, largely because they're the ones doing it, and that is the servitors of the Imperium. Which, if you look at them, you probably are wondering, who on earth would want to succumb themselves to this?
So the servitors that's a person. It's like that's a thing. The thing I'm looking at right now.
Yeah. So AI is outlawed. You
God.
can't have any AI. So what better way to have a computer do kind of AI things by having it be somebody's actual brain?
Oh.
So these are effectively all like they are machine beings that have just been lobotomized to hell and essentially given a job, and that job is to do whatever. And sometimes, they are combat servitors. Sometimes they literally are just working on assembly lines. They are at times just scribes. They are conceptually one of the most horrifying punishments that you can get.
Yeah, I kind of hate all of it. If I'm being honest.
Yeah. So in Dark Tide, the video game, the healing station and many of the computers are also servitors. And there's one important thing about a servitor, which is, again, kind of horrifying and really kind of sits into like I said, into that horror side of 40K. And that is, while they are, lobotomized and therefore, and it's so far to a point where generally it's like there is no recollection to who they once were, right? They are effectively brain dead outside of their ability to still function. Except when they don't. Except when they glitch. And that piece of their mind kind of sneaks back out.
They don't have that ironed out yet? That's just a thing that happens on occasion?
It's just part of the unfortunate difficulties upon trying to work with and build through a human brain without, going all the way into AI territories. And inevitably, unfortunately, the Imperium probably doesn't care a whole lot, because this is, in the end, generally a punishment for people. There is some scenarios in stories where there have been like kind of weird things with this. One example is in the book Ephriel Stern. And there's an Inquisitor character that is kind of like the second POV character in the book. And he had another, essentially it was like a servant and like bodyguard of his. It was somebody that inherently he was very close to. He had been on a number of battles with. He had gone to a number of different various investigations. They've spent almost, they spent over a century together. Like, they were inherently very tight. But unfortunately, the kind of the assistant died in a battle, and I forgot what, but died in combat, and most of the body relatively intact, and there was a bit of their brain activity like kind of savable. So what he did is he turned them into a servitor, and instead of it just kind of being in the sense of like, this horrid tortured existence, it was, a little bit more kind of, I mean, it was similar, right? But it was very much more in that personal computer thing. You know how in like sci-fi movies they'll do that thing where it's like they uploaded his consciousness into the ship, and now the ship's computer has their personality.
Right.
It was like a little bit more akin to that, right? And so the body was kind of this mix of man and machine, or corpse and machine. But parts of the way the servitor would speak had, while it wouldn't think for itself, it attained a little bit of that personality, right? And he did that not because he had felt to punish them, but because he inevitably wanted to keep them around. But the Mechanicus themselves are big users of especially combat servitors, but also every other type of servitor outside of, their forge worlds and their assembly lines. You also then obviously have things like the Cataphren battle servitors, which are essentially these giant mobile tanks. And that's kind of just what they are. They're kind of just they just seem to be the result of some Mechanicus at some points just really fucked up thought of like, what can we do with all these criminals?
What are the servitors capable of doing on the battlefield that like other soldiers couldn't do?
They have no fear, right? They don't have feelings for that matter. So, they can take shots, they can be hit with bullets, whatever, and they're not gonna flinch outside of, if it's a giant blast wave that, just does a bunch of damage to it physically. You're sending effectively a robot zombie out into the field. It doesn't have the mind or conscience to worry about things that maybe the guard would run into, right? And so for especially and it's kind of a meme, right? That's like, oh, I insulted somebody in the 40K universe. Looks like you're going to be that servitor now. Or like if you got warped, and it's like, or the common one is like, dudes what they think they'd become if they got transported to the 40K universe, what they would actually be, and then it's it goes from being a space marine into a servitor.
It's the zombie apocalypse thing.
Well, it's just like
you think you'd be the one killing all the zombies, but you would very much probably be a zombie.
Right, exactly. But it's not actually like very incredibly likely. Most of these people that are servitors are who have become them are, either, like wanted for big, like large treasonous acts, and I mean like legitimate ones, murder, especially like continual or serial or mass. There are obviously examples though of petty reasons people have become servitors. Like you're looking at effectively a giant fascist imperium with a bunch of nobles that think themselves far more important than they are. But most of the time that really isn't happening. Like I said, that those are more rare. Like most of the people who are these servitors have honestly generally probably actually done something pretty wrong. Now obviously doesn't make it right, but that's just more like why they choose who they choose. So and instead of just killing them, which would be wasteful, to use them by lobotomizing them and strapping a cannon to their arm. And that's what they do.
If it worked for Mega Man, it'll work for me.
If it was only just as wholesome in its reasoning with his Mega Man. But especially like how with a lot of Mechanicus, they'll like see, oh well, this good thing happened. Okay, well we're gonna ignore this part. Then we're gonna put that under the rug, and we're gonna say this happened. All right, cool. And somebody who's really good at that and very important to the AdMech is, I have to double check his full title here before is Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call. Just look at him.
Is that a skull perched up on the top. I don't think skulls are technology. I feel like he's kind of cheating here.
Well, actually, servo skulls are really important to the Imperium as a whole.
What is a servo skull?
It is honestly, it's very simple, really. It is just, so a servo skull is literally just a skull where instead of everything that it once had in it is just filled with a bunch of servos and like anti-grav things so it can float around, and is honestly just kind of used. It's just a Imperial Gothic looking way of going around and looking and using it a lot of times as like a spy glass. You can look through it. It can feed things back to, like a ship computer. Like you can use them to scout around. Like
so
they
kind of like the tower
are kind of just drones. Yeah. They're just really very basic. They don't do anything else. They're just basic drones. Like they're like flying our drones of today, but instead they're a skull.
They just look
the ones
cool,
he has
and that's
on
all
him,
you need to know.
Kinda. I mean, yeah, like I said, the ones that he has probably are a similar thing, but I mean, as you can kind of also tell, like he has, it also looks like a big megaphone on his head. He's got a lot going on with him. There's a lot with him. He is probably about 95% machine. He is also 10,000 years old. And he has somehow been able to escape the claws of time and age. However, has been a very key member of the Imperium, especially within this 41st and 42nd millennia. He was instructed just after the heresy to work by Rabute Gilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, who, after the Emperor fell to Horus, was the regent of the Imperium. Mm-hmm. He was tasked to work on a life-sustaining armor and to protect the Emperor's blade, and inevitably would begin work on what would become Primaris Marines. That part was more of like a loose kind of thing that he was given by Gilliman, but he kind of took it his own direction a little bit, but they went with it. So, and Rabute was okay with it. But he has been known to be a little bit more controversial when it comes to the AdMech, not with the community. The community loves him. It's just in lore, he's controversial.
Sure.
Because he is definitely a little bit more willing to use some Xenos tech. He may have a secret AI that he disguises as a copy of his consciousness called Call Inferior. But it's kind of been shown in stories and whatnot that it very likely does, in fact, have seemingly its own sentience, which, if it's just a copy of his consciousness, shouldn't. But he does all this for the advancement of the Imperium. He's incredibly loyal. Like, he very much, especially to the Emperor himself. He early on once kind of had the belief that, like, he, when he was young and he went through kind of this soul merge with another tech priest that kind of was trying to trick him, he kind of saw this memory that was latent in the guy that he merged with and took over. And the Emperor had spoken directly to Call at that time, telling him that he would have to do that he essentially would need to do in order what is to be done for the Imperium and for advancement of humanity, even if it would have to go against his own beliefs, which at the time he, was not super keen on, but has, especially since then, definitely embraced a lot more. And so then after the fall of Cadia, he was able to finalize the Primaris project after he resurrected Gilliman with a group of Eldari called the Yanari, which we'll get to when we talk about the Eldar. That's just kind of more for you to keep that in mind for later, but for now, don't worry too much about it. And so other than that, that is largely where the AdMech remain now. Call is out there working on his next great project, somewhat secretly. You know, the AdMech continue to work with the Imperium, finding STCs, helping, fill the armies of the Imperium. They often are working, tech priests often are with the Imperial Guard. There are a number of them that will go there to obviously maintain all of the vehicles and, whatnot that the Guard use, because they use such a wide variety of them.
So Call, and I promise I'm not trying to make a pun here, Call is still calling the shots as far as the Adeptus Mechanicus goes. Like, he is the like quote unquote leader. Like, he is who they all look to.
Kind of. There is the General Mechanicus is run by a council.
A council.
There is a larger council that runs them. It doesn't come up super often outside of when Call is kind of being disciplined. But they are, they generally then are the ones mostly in charge. And because there are many Archmagos, but he is also kind of one of the highest ranking Archmagos. Like, he does have a lot of power, and he does have a lot of followers, and those who kind of believe in his wild, radical thoughts of innovation.
When you have clout, you can do anything.
Yeah. But he obviously still has to be careful about the way he does innovation, because he still can be completely cut off by the AdMech, and has been attempted to in the past. They have tried to do this to him.
So the council has had to reconvene on occasion because he was messing around with alien tech and needed to be put in detention
mostly for his
bit.
Yeah, mostly actually it was just for his attempts at innovation. Mostly. That's really the main reason they've had issues with him.
Mm-hmm. And when we say
it certainly
innovation,
doesn't help.
Like, what?
I mean it literally.
Yeah.
I mean him trying to take something and improve it, make it more efficient, make it better. I mean, the Space Marines are an example of that with the Primaris.
Mm-hmm.
There were Space Marines, and he thought there's a way to make this better. The Emperor would have tried to do this. I will do this too. And he did it, and Gilliman signed off on it, and it was done. But that was, again, one of those things that he was doing to seek forgiveness rather than permission. But it definitely would have gotten him in trouble had it been discovered earlier.
Is this like a 10 strikes you're out kind of situation? Like, if this has happened,
it's all politics.
I'm just curious about, like, what's the breaking point after everything that
it's hard to say, because the problem is, especially with Gilliman kind of owing Call his life, it's really hard to say that inevitably that they wouldn't be able to completely remove Call without getting into some type of trouble without stirring the eye of the greater Imperium. And while they are the ones who maybe own the machines, there is some they don't necessarily want to go into a civil war. There's a lot with it, so there's a lot of politics involved on that, which is often what does come up in Call's books for sure, and other AdMech books and stories. But let's talk about the army of the AdMech, which will get us into gameplay as well. And that is with the group of the Mechanicus called the Skitari.
The Skitari.
Yes, the Skitari are the warrior sect of
Skittles
the AdMech. And yeah, I mean, they're not full-blown tech priests, but they are much like them and akin to them, but instead are still foot soldiers. So they are more trained and advanced than, say, your Imperial Guardsmen, but not maybe, say, as refined as a Sister of Battle or a Space Marine. But they do get really cool weapons because they've got technology. The Skitari have a good number of units to their name. So we have obviously your normal, Skitari soldiers or rangers. They are often found with what kind of look like almost like musket like rifles or maybe like World War II level rifles. I guess it kind of depends on your intake on it.
Do they craft them, or do they find them?
Oh yeah, no, they'll produce them. They once they find blueprints for stuff, they'll prime it out. They're building everything that they use.
Sure.
And so they are like, their rangers are great at range. They also inherently are holders of, like I said, like kind of some fun weaponries. Like they literally have rifles that are arc rifles, so they just shoot out giant blasts of lightning. They are big users of plasma weaponry, which is just, highly strong and volatile energy that can literally explode in your own arms if you overheat the weapon, killing you. A function I have done with plasma weapons while playing the tabletop game.
Oh, it's an actual mechanic. Okay.
That's fun. When you roll to hit on with a plasma weapon, you could choose before you roll to overcharge it. You get bonus to armor pen and strength of the weapon, or like of the attack against the defense of your opponent. Mm-hmm. However, if you roll a 1, and remember it's a D6, so if you roll a 1 on a hazardous check, if you roll a 1 on a hazardous check, the gun explodes and you take a mortal wound, which is of like essentially 1 damage in like D&D terms. Mm-hmm. And so it's like an unsavable hit. And especially with my sisters, who generally often have 1 wound, or I think it's 3 wounds. Still, most of them have 1 wound. They die. As you know, but the Skitarii, a lot of them also only have 1 wound. But their things are more about the defense instead of their actual health. But yeah, they have because they are so the thing about the Skitarii and like the tabletop is there's 2 big things we'll have to go over with them. The first thing is they are relatively newer amongst the playable tabletop factions of 40K. I think they came out, I believe it was in 7th edition. It was 7th or 8th edition. So you're looking at within the last like 8 or so years, which for 40K, a game that came out in the 80s, is pretty recent, right?
Yeah, definitely.
It might be around 10, but not that part isn't as important, right? They're a newer army in the grand scheme of things. Mm-hmm. And so part of this is their line is all really cool looking because they're all in plastic. They make this bigger. They're all in plastic. They have good sculpts on their models themselves. On the tabletop, they only represent this Skitarii part. They have very little when it comes to like the grander part of the mechanic, like the tech priests and the Mechanicus part.
It's
so
limited
the tech
to
priests
Skitarii.
are a lot of that way, yeah. But it's kind of hard, right? Because for a tabletop war game, right? Like, what do you do to make it more Mechanicus-y when a lot of the Mechanicus is, tech priests that are searching and aren't necessarily mainly combatants. But I think the more new stuff that eventually will probably start coming out for the AdMech over time, I think we'll probably start getting more and more tech priest stuff, but it's probably just going to take a bit of time. But the downside of them being newer is they are unfortunately then price tagged for being a newer army. So because they have newer sculpts means that their sculpts cost at more of a fuller price, which is tough right now because of where they are in the game. Because if you are currently an AdMech fan and want to play them on the tabletop, it's a little hard to do so right now if you're just getting into the game.
Yeah.
Because, you know, a relatively decent metric for kind of deciding how good of value an army is their points per dollar kind of marketing, right? It's, you know, if you buy this box, how many points of an army are you getting in it? For context in general, you kind of want it to be maybe somewhere around like $4 or $5 per point.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe the other way around. Sorry, the ratio I can get mixed up in my head. You generally, though, want that number obviously to be not 1-to-1. Because effectively you're now in a scenario where you're potentially spending $2,000 to make a 2,000 point army. And that's if you were to not do stuff used. That's if you only bought MSRP, all that stuff. Which you should never do, stuff like that. But it's a wild concept, right? It's just, like, for example, this chicken walker I showed you earlier, the Iron Strider, you know, in order to play them in 40K, you have to get a unit of, I think it's 2 of them, but only one of them comes in a $60 box. So to make one unit, you have to pay $120.
Yeah, that doesn't seem right.
No. So this will change. This is not a permanent issue, right? So if you like the AdMech, obviously you can get started on them. But take it slow. Because
pace yourself.
This will change eventually, right? It might be a while, and it may not even be this edition. Hopefully that's not the case. Hopefully do something like an errata or something like that to help them out. But this will eventually change. Your models will always be there. The books and the rules will change. That's always an important rule to remember. So that being said, their play style is actually pretty unique, but also like they're unique in flavor, but not in, I guess, raw gameplay. In raw gameplay, they're mostly ranged, and this is true in lore too, relatively. You know, they're mostly ranged. They generally don't really have much for melee combat, except outside of maybe a few units. Mm-hmm. Honestly, the units that probably would give them more melee capacity would be actual normal Mechanicus Tech Priest units. But other things that can help them a lot with their melee are one of my favorite units in the entire army, which is their Castellan robots, which if you look at them, they are straight out of Fallout.
Oh, wow, yeah. Very Brotherhood.
Mm-hmm. And I love them. They look so cool. They just like, I mean, because I love the Fallout aesthetic too, but and those are just robots. Like those are straight up just robots. Those aren't suits for them to wear. They're straight up robots. Because let's be real, if a Mechanicus was going to like get into a suit of machinery, like of armor and stuff like this, it wouldn't be a suit. They would just be putting themselves in it permanently. Because that's how their mind works. They don't have a crazy high level of melee combatancy when they're in game, but it does exist. They're not like the Tau where they're completely, screwed if they get into melee combat. They are still relatively able to hold their own, but they are not, the power armored armies of 40K of humanity, like in 40K. Like they are relatively fragile. They do have to be careful with themselves, right? Gotcha. But they do similarly then get plenty of, you can add plenty of machinery, vehicles that can do some damage. They have vehicles to help them get into battle.
You said before that they were introduced into the game within the past decade or so. Were they in lore before that, or was that actually their full introduction?
No. Yeah, they've been in lore pretty much since the game had lore.
Okay.
They mostly were just kind of used in gameplay side as just part of the Imperial Guard. They would just have like a tech priest in the guard units.
Oh, okay.
But they were otherwise just lore based. And then like the concept was mostly just that like before the Skitarii got introduced into the lore, they were essentially then just always like with Imperial Guard members and stuff like that. Or the tech priests would just be by themselves because they on their own were fully capable of protecting themselves, which is why like in the game Adeptus Mechanicus, I keep coming back to it, but it's such a good example of how they work. It really is. It's a great example of how they work. You are, I think it's like 6 characters, right? And that is often how AdMech will go explore planets. They won't bring an army in to start. They'll start with just sending 6 tech priests. And those 6 tech priests might be able to deal with, an entire Necron tomb, Granted, it won't be at full strength, but still, like, they can deal with a multitude of enemies on their own because they are inherently very strong individually. But back then, the way that people saw the AdMech was kind of like how, you would see the Custodes today. Right, and similarly, why the Custodes didn't have an army for quite some time in the tabletop game either, because they were always just kind of thought as this small group of people going out in small squads, which doesn't work for a war game generally, right? If your army that goes out to do things is generally always only like 6 people, that doesn't really work well for a war game unless, your army is like Imperial or Chaos Knights, where your entire army, though, while it's 6 things, they're all giant mechs.
Sure. Yeah.
So they like count as like 20 things in one thing. But that wouldn't be the case with the tech priest, right? So like it would just be kind of they would be getting overrun by numbers. But eventually, obviously, as the Skitarii get more and more introduced and fleshed out, then they realize, okay, we can make an army out of this. Now we can introduce them to the game. So they just have a number of things that probably need to be worked on gameplay wise. But honestly, I thought about, they were one of the armies that I was actually going to go with when I was starting. And this is kind of maybe my one thing to like, as like the warning for the army kind of thing, is that for new people is, look at it's not even look at Call, right? Let's look at the Skitarii Rangers, right? Like there's a lot of detail on this model, right? There's a lot of mechanical parts. There's different things going places. There's a lot of extra antennas and stuff like that. And that can be intimidating for somebody who's just starting out and who hasn't really painted models before, right?
Yeah, a lot of fine details.
Yeah, so that was kind of where I was like, maybe I'll do it later. And I've kind of moved away from that concept a little bit, but I still greatly enjoy their style, their look and all that. But they are obviously like, that is kind of the one thing you need to be aware of. You can simplify them. There is absolutely a way to simplify them, right? You can take, obviously you can deal with a lot of this stuff if you look at it in some separate ways, right? Like you could just focus, if you focus all the red down on the robes, then you just at least just get all the just slap metallic colors on everything that looks metal, right? And then just put some, get some, light blue contrast paint or something and just dibble it in a couple spots where there's energy and you're done, right? You could make it very simple. You could simplify it. There's a way to make it done. And there are tutorials to do that, right? There are noob-friendly, AdMech tutorials out there. And then you can expand to more complex models, right? You can move forward to models that, have the bat wings and stuff like that.
Yeah, those wings look very intimidating.
But you can do that when you're more comfortable. but I wasn't willing to do that, so I didn't. Also, when I kind of learned about the price point, it was I say that in the sense that I didn't then pick the second most expensive army afterward, but regardless, that is about it. They are the Adeptus Mechanicus. They're funky. They love machines. Maybe a little too much. But you know what? It's obviously working.
No, they are funky, but it's a cool funky.
Yeah, well, it's like clearly whatever they're doing, it's working. Yeah. Because their shit hasn't failed yet. Mm-hmm. So clearly it's working. But anything that you have for coming into the end of this year? I want to hear your thoughts, concerns, questions.
No, I mean, so this is another one of those where the name Adeptus Mechanicus I had heard, usually without context, but it's just one of those things where it's like if you hear somebody talking about Warhammer, they would talk about this. So I was really interested in how new they are to the game, while not necessarily being new to like the overall lore and the story, because they definitely feel like they've made a huge impact enough that like you mentioned the Necrons a couple times, and I'm interested for when we reach that point as well, because that's another one that I've heard that name quite a bit, and we even talked about them in the first episode a little bit. So it seemed like there was a lot of like a bit of like an interstitial weave going on between the Mechanicus and the Necrons there. But yeah, it was interesting to hear about them. I'm definitely more familiar before this with the idea of like Imperial armies that would then have like a tech priest with them. So like kind of like what you were talking about, like how it used to be in the game where you didn't see like these like the Skitarii, like a full army for the Adeptus Mechanicus. It was more so that there would be like a tech priest here and there, and that was like a big deal. So it was cool to get more context on that, and that there is like this full like army that the Mechanicus have, but they still do have that kind of interesting like will they won't they relationship with the Imperium by way of the treaty, which I'm sorry, I don't. That's crazy to me that treaty is still valid after so much time. Like,
yeah, it's definitely lessened in its meaning, but yeah. No, it's lessened in its meaning, but it is for sure technically still abiding.
I'm waiting for the Callus heresy to happen, and
that is something that Gilliman has been preparing for.
Yeah,
right? They are very much like he is very much aware of the threat that this innovative world could lead to.
Yeah, cool unit, cool faction. They lived up to the hype. They're really interesting.
So that's what we'll call this episode. No pun intended. We'll see you next week for a faction. I haven't fully decided what it'll be yet. Because there's two that really come to mind. So in case I just change my mind last minute, I don't want to be stuck with it because of saying it at the end of this episode. So find out next week.
I like it. I like the mystery. Keep them on their toes.
Let's just say it will probably, no matter what, it's going to involve some green. See you next time.